Maybe God brought you here tonight because your soul has been crying in silence for far too long. God says there is something you have been carrying deep inside your heart. Something nobody else fully sees. Every sleepless night, every quiet breakdown behind closed doors, every moment you smiled while secretly feeling empty inside. Heaven saw it all. And tonight God is warning you gently before your pain hardens your heart completely. Do not ignore this message tonight, because what feels like exhaustion is not just physical anymore. Your spirit has been under attack. The enemy wants you to believe you are forgotten, abandoned, too broken to be healed. But God says that is a lie. If you are listening to this right now, this is not an accident. Before we continue, take a moment to comment your location and local time below. I would love to know where you are watching from tonight, and if this message is already touching your heart. Gently subscribe and stay until the end, because God may be speaking directly to you tonight. There are people listening to this tonight who are exhausted in ways they cannot explain. Not just physically tired, not the kind of tired that sleep can fix. I'm talking about the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into the soul. The kind that follows you into quiet rooms. The kind that sits beside you in the dark while rain taps softly against the window and the clock keeps moving past midnight. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you've been carrying it for months, maybe for years. God says He has seen every moment of it. Every silent breakdown in your car before walking into work pretending everything was fine. Every night you stared at the ceiling wondering how much longer you could keep holding yourself together. Every tear you wiped away before anyone else noticed. Every prayer you whispered softly into the dark, wondering if heaven was still listening. God heard all of it. Maybe people around you think you are strong. Maybe they think you're handling life well, but deep down your heart has been fighting battles nobody knows about. Battles with fear, battles with loneliness, battles with disappointment so heavy it changed the way you see yourself. And little by little something inside you started fading. Your peace faded, your hope faded, your energy faded, even your faith began to feel distant. God says that is why this message found you tonight. Because you have been trying to survive while secretly feeling empty inside. Perhaps you still remember the version of yourself that used to dream more. The version that used to laugh freely. The version that believed life would eventually get better. But somewhere along the way, pain slowly convinced you to stop expecting good things. And now you wake up already tired. You smile while your soul feels numb. You scroll endlessly at night because silence feels too loud. You distract yourself because being alone with your thoughts has become terrifying. But God says He understands the pain you never fully explained to anyone else. He saw you sitting alone in that dark bedroom. He saw you driving those quiet roads late at night with tears in your eyes. He saw you standing in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to sleep, trying to keep yourself from falling apart. And even when you stopped talking to Him the way you used to, He never stopped listening. Maybe this message is hard for you to believe right now, because disappointment has changed your heart. You prayed for things that never happened. You trusted people who broke you. You waited for answers that never came. And after a while, exhaustion became your normal. But God says something dangerous has been happening slowly inside you. Your pain has been trying to convince you that nothing will ever change. That you will always feel this way. That healing is for other people, not for you. That joy belongs to everyone else. And perhaps the scariest part is that you started believing it. You started accepting sadness as your permanent reality. You stopped expecting peace, stopped expecting love, stopped expecting God to move in your life at all. But tonight, God is interrupting that darkness before it completely hardens your heart. This is the warning, not a warning of punishment. Not a warning of destruction. A warning that your spirit has been under attack for far too long. The enemy knows that if he can keep you exhausted, he can keep you distant from God. If he can keep you hopeless, he can keep you spiritually asleep. If he can convince you that nobody cares, eventually you will stop reaching for the light altogether. And maybe that has already been happening. Maybe you still believe in God, but only from a distance now. Maybe you still pray sometimes, but without expectation. Maybe your faith has become quieter and quieter because life wounded you more deeply than anyone realizes. But God says your exhaustion does not make you weak. It makes you wounded. There is a difference. Wounded people often blame themselves for struggling. They apologize for being tired. They hide their pain so nobody feels burdened. But God says your soul was never meant to carry this much weight alone. That is why you feel so tired. You have been carrying grief that was too heavy, fear that was too heavy, memories that were too heavy, regret that was too heavy. And through it all, you kept trying to survive without letting anyone truly see how broken you felt inside. But heaven sees it. Heaven always saw it. Even now, while you are listening to these words, God is closer than you think. Closer than the anxiety. Closer than the depression. Closer than the fear that keeps whispering that your future will never change. Maybe God brought you here tonight because your soul needed this reminder before giving up completely. Because there is still purpose over your life. There is still healing ahead of you. There is still light waiting beyond this season of darkness, even if you cannot feel it yet. And God says tonight is not the night to give up. Not emotionally, not spiritually, not mentally, not on yourself. Because something inside you is still fighting to survive. Even after everything. Even after the heartbreak. Even after the disappointment. Even after the nights when you secretly wondered if anyone would even notice your pain. God noticed. God always notices. And tonight, before you close your eyes, before the silence returns, before the fear starts speaking again, God wants you to hear this clearly. You are not forgotten. You are not abandoned. And your story is not over yet. But there is still something slowly destroying your spirit. Something God is asking you to confront before it steals the last piece of peace remaining inside your heart. God says the greatest danger in your life right now may not be what is happening around you, but what has been quietly happening inside you. Because pain changes people slowly, not all at once, little by little, silently, almost invisibly. At first you only feel disappointed. Then disappointed turns into exhaustion. Exhaustion turns into numbness. And eventually numbness becomes a place where nothing moves inside your heart anymore. That is the warning God is trying to show you tonight. Not because he wants to shame you. Not because he is angry with you. But because he loves you too much to watch your spirit slowly disappear. Maybe lately you've noticed it yourself. You do not react to things the way you used to. Things that once made you happy barely move you now. You feel emotionally distant from people. Even moments of peace feel temporary. And deep down, there is a quiet voice inside you whispering, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. God says he has heard that voice. He has seen the emotional fatigue nobody else understands. The way your mind keeps replaying old pain late at night. The way fear follows you into quiet moments. The way disappointment keeps trying to convince you that hope is dangerous. Perhaps you trusted someone who betrayed you. Perhaps you loved deeply and still ended up abandoned. Perhaps you prayed for healing and watched things fall apart anyway. And after enough heartbreak, something inside you began shutting down emotionally just to survive. That is what the enemy wanted. Not necessarily to destroy your life overnight, but to slowly drain your spirit until you stopped believing anything good could still happen for you. Because hopelessness is one of the enemy's favorite weapons. When a person loses hope, they stop fighting. They stop praying. They stop dreaming. They stop believing healing is possible. And eventually they start accepting emotional darkness as normal. Maybe that has been happening to you without you even realizing it. You wake up tired. You move through the day emotionally disconnected. You feel lonely even in rooms full of people. You keep saying I'm okay while your soul quietly breaks underneath the surface. And perhaps nobody truly knows how heavy your heart has become. But God knows. God says heaven has been watching you carry burdens you were never meant to carry alone. That bitterness you keep holding on to. That grief you never processed. That anger you buried so deeply it became part of your personality. that disappointment you keep replaying every night. God says all of it has been poisoning your peace slowly. And maybe the hardest part is this. You became so used to surviving that you forgot what living peacefully even feels like. Maybe you cannot remember the last time your mind felt calm, the last time you slept without anxiety, the last time your heart felt safe. You became trapped in survival mode for so long that your soul forgot how to rest. But tonight God is calling your spirit awake again, because the enemy has been trying to convince you that your current emotional state is permanent, that you will always feel broken, always feel exhausted, always feel disconnected, always feel emotionally damaged. But God says that is not your future. Even now, while you are listening to this, heaven is fighting for you in ways you cannot see. Maybe you feel weak tonight. Maybe your faith feels small. Maybe your heart feels too tired to believe again. But God says even exhausted souls can still be restored. Even wounded hearts can heal again. Even people who almost gave up can still find light. Perhaps this message found you tonight because God knew you were reaching a breaking point emotionally. God knew you were tired of pretending, tired of carrying invisible pain, tired of fighting silent battles in your mind every single day, and before hopelessness completely consumed your spirit. God interrupted your night with this message because He refuses to let darkness have the final word over your life. Maybe you think you've drifted too far from Him. Maybe you stopped praying consistently, stopped reading scripture, stopped expecting God to speak to you personally. But God says distance never stopped Him from loving you. Not once. Even during the nights you cried yourself to sleep. Even during the moments you questioned Him. Even during the seasons where your faith almost disappeared completely. He stayed, quietly, faithfully, patiently. And tonight He is asking you to confront the things slowly destroying your soul before it steals even more from you. Maybe it is bitterness. Maybe it is fear. Maybe it is shame. Maybe it is the belief that you are too broken to be healed anymore. Whatever it is, God says it cannot follow you into the next season of your life. Because where God is leading you, your spirit must heal first. Your heart must soften again. Your faith must breathe again. And perhaps that process begins tonight. Not with a dramatic miracle. Not with instant answers. But with honesty. Honesty about how tired you truly are. Honesty about how much pain you've been hiding. Honesty about how badly your soul needs God again. Maybe you do not need to have everything figured out tonight. Maybe you only need to stop running emotionally. To stop pretending you are fine. To stop carrying pain in silence while slowly collapsing inside. Because God says healing begins the moment you finally admit how wounded you really are. And maybe that is why this message reached you tonight. Not to condemn you, but to wake you up spiritually before hopelessness becomes your permanent identity. Because the enemy wants your heart cold, numb, disconnected. But God still sees life inside you, even now, even after everything. And tonight He is asking you one question gently. Will you continue letting pain define your spirit? Or will you finally let God begin healing what has been broken inside you for so long? God says this is your wake-up call. Not the kind that comes with noise or chaos. Not the kind that arrives through fear or destruction. But the quiet kind. The kind that reaches you in the middle of the night when the world becomes stuck and your thoughts become impossible to escape. Maybe that is where you are right now. Alone with your thoughts. Alone with memories you keep replaying. Alone with emotions you tried to bury beneath distractions, work, fake smiles, and endless scrolling. But no matter how hard you tried to avoid it, your soul kept feeling restless. Because deep down part of you knew something was wrong spiritually. God says you have been ignoring signs for longer than you realize. Small moments, gentle warnings, quiet convictions, the random verse that appeared exactly when you needed it. The message you accidentally clicked that somehow spoke directly to your pain. The strange feeling in your chest during prayer. The nights you felt an urge to cry even when you could not explain why. Those moments were not coincidences. God was trying to reach you, again and again. Because heaven could see what was happening inside you long before anyone else did. Perhaps outwardly your life still looks normal. Maybe people around you have no idea how emotionally exhausted you truly are. But God says your spirit has been starving quietly, starving for peace, starving for rest, starving for connection with Him again. And the frightening part is that you became used to living disconnected, used to emotional heaviness, used to carrying anxiety everywhere you go, used to surviving instead of truly living. Maybe there was a time when your relationship with God felt stronger, a time when faith came naturally, a time when hope felt alive inside you. But after enough disappointment, enough heartbreak, enough unanswered questions, something changed. You stopped expecting God to move. You stopped opening your heart completely. You still believed He existed, but you no longer believed He would personally intervene in your pain. So slowly, without realizing it, your heart began drifting. Not all at once, just little by little. Prayer became less frequent. Faith became quieter. Hope became harder to hold on to. And eventually, emotional numbness settled into places inside you that once felt full of life. God says this is why He is waking you up tonight. Because if you continue ignoring the condition of your spirit, pain will eventually become your identity. And that was never His plan for you. Maybe you have been waiting for some giant sign from heaven, while ignoring the quiet voice of conviction already speaking inside you. Perhaps God has been whispering to you for months, through exhaustion, through loneliness, through moments where nothing external was wrong, yet internally you still felt empty. God often speaks softly before life becomes louder, and maybe tonight is one of those moments where He is trying to get your attention, before your soul drifts even further into darkness. Not because He wants to control you, but because He loves you. Real love warns people before destruction fully takes hold. Real love confronts what is unhealthy. Real love refuses to stay silent while someone slowly destroys themselves emotionally and spiritually. Maybe there is something in your life right now that God has been asking you to release. A relationship that keeps draining your peace. A habit that keeps numbing your soul. A mindset built entirely around fear. An attachment to pain you secretly do not know how to live without anymore. Sometimes people become so familiar with suffering that healing feels uncomfortable. Sometimes people stay emotionally attached to sadness because it became part of who they are. But God says you cannot heal while continuing to hold on to the thing that is breaking you. You cannot keep reopening the same wound and expect peace to grow there. And perhaps that is difficult for you to hear tonight. Because letting go feels terrifying. At least pain is familiar. At least disappointment is predictable. At least emotional walls feel safe. But God says those walls are also isolating you from the healing your soul desperately needs. Maybe you have convinced yourself you are protecting your heart, but in reality you have been imprisoning it. You stopped trusting people, stopped opening up emotionally, stopped believing anyone could truly understand your pain. And somewhere deep inside you even stopped fully trusting God, not because you hated Him, but because disappointment made your heart afraid. Afraid to hope again, afraid to believe again, afraid to expect goodness and lose it all over again. God says He understands that fear. He saw what happened to you. He saw the betrayal, the abandonment, the grief, the nights you cried until your chest physically hurt, the moments where silence in your room felt unbearably heavy. He saw all of it, and still He stayed near you, even when you pushed Him away emotionally, even when you stopped listening spiritually, even when you convinced yourself nobody cared anymore. God remained faithful. Perhaps this message found you tonight because heaven knows you are standing at an emotional crossroads. One path leads deeper into bitterness, deeper into numbness, deeper into isolation. The other path leads toward healing, but it requires surrender. It requires honesty. It requires finally admitting that your soul cannot survive disconnected from God forever. And maybe tonight is the beginning of that return. Not perfect, not dramatic, not instant, but real. Maybe tonight is the night you finally stop pretending your spirit is okay when it is actually exhausted. Maybe tonight is the night you finally allow God to confront the hidden pain you kept avoiding. Because God says healing cannot begin where denial still exists. And perhaps the hardest truth of all is this: the thing hurting you most right now may not only be what happened to you, but what you became after the pain. Cold, guarded, emotionally distant. spiritually tired, and tonight God is asking you softly but clearly, will you continue running from the healing your soul desperately needs? Or will you finally let Him awaken the parts of your heart that have been asleep for far too long? God says there are things you keep holding on to that are quietly destroying your peace. And perhaps you already know exactly what they are. Maybe it is a relationship you know is hurting your spirit, yet you keep returning because loneliness scares you more than pain. Maybe it is bitterness you have carried for so many years that it feels impossible to release now. Maybe it is guilt that follows you everywhere you go like a shadow. Or maybe it is an old wound you never allowed God to fully heal because part of you still bleeds every time you remember what happened. God says you cannot keep carrying poison in your heart and expect your soul to feel alive. Eventually, emotional pain begins affecting everything. The way you think, the way you sleep, the way you trust, the way you love, the way you see yourself, even the way you see God. And maybe that is why your spirit feels so exhausted lately. Not because you are weak, but because you have been emotionally carrying things that were slowly crushing you from the inside. Perhaps there are nights when memories return so strongly that it feels like the pain happened yesterday. A certain song, a certain street, a certain photograph, a certain empty room late at night. Suddenly your chest tightens again. Suddenly your mind starts replaying old conversations, old disappointments, old betrayals, old regrets, and without realizing it, you begin reliving wounds God has been trying to heal. God says many people become trapped in cycles of emotional suffering because pain becomes familiar. Even unhealthy sadness can start feeling safe after enough time. At least suffering is predictable. At least disappointment no longer surprises you. At least emotional walls prevent new heartbreak. But those same walls also prevent healing. They prevent closeness. They prevent peace. And eventually they begin isolating you from the life God wants you to experience. Maybe you tell yourself you are protecting your heart, but secretly your heart has become imprisoned by fear. Fear of trusting again. Fear of hoping again. Fear of loving again. Fear of losing again. So instead of risking disappointment, you emotionally shut down little by little. You become distant, careful, guarded, and eventually exhausted. Because pretending not to care still hurts. God says some of you listening tonight are emotionally attached to things that are draining your spirit daily. People who constantly wound you, thought patterns that constantly condemn you, habits that temporarily numb your pain, but deepen your emptiness afterward. And deep inside you already know those things are hurting you. But letting go feels impossible because your heart became dependent on what is familiar even when it is unhealthy. Perhaps you keep revisiting old pain because part of you still hopes the past will somehow change. Perhaps you keep replaying what happened because your soul is searching for closure. Perhaps you keep holding on to anger because forgiving feels unfair. God understands all of that. He understands how difficult it is to release what wounded you deeply. But God also knows what bitterness eventually becomes if left untreated. Bitterness hardens the heart slowly. It steals softness from your spirit. It turns love into suspicion, trust into fear, hope into cynicism. And over time, the person suffering most becomes you. Maybe that is why you feel emotionally heavy all the time. Because unresolved pain is exhausting. Carrying resentment every day is exhausting. Trying to survive while secretly bleeding inside is exhausting. And tonight God says your soul is tired. Because it was never designed to carry this kind of weight forever. Perhaps you have been asking God for peace while still holding tightly to the thing destroying your peace. Perhaps you have been praying for healing while refusing to release what keeps reopening the wound. God says there comes a moment where healing requires surrender. Not partial surrender, complete surrender, even when it hurts, even when it feels unfair, even when your emotions are screaming to hold on. Maybe tonight God is asking you to release something your heart became addicted to emotionally. A relationship, a memory, a version of yourself, a dream that died, a painful identity you secretly built your life around. Because some people become so identified with their suffering that they no longer know who they are without it. Pain becomes their personality, their protection, their excuse to stay emotionally distant. But God says you were not created to live chained to grief forever. You were not created to remain trapped in emotional darkness. You were not created to spend your entire life surviving instead of healing. Perhaps the hardest thing about healing is that it requires trust before results appear. You let go before you fully understand what comes next. You surrender before you see the restoration. And that uncertainty terrifies wounded hearts, especially hearts that have already experienced loss. Maybe you're afraid that if you release your pain, nothing will remain. Maybe anger feels stronger than vulnerability. Maybe numbness feels safer than hope. But God says numbness is not peace. Isolation is not healing. Emotional shutdown is not strength. Real healing happens when your heart becomes soft enough for God to touch the places you spent years hiding from everyone else. Maybe this message found you tonight because heaven knows how close you are to emotional collapse. You are tired of carrying silent pain, tired of pretending you are okay, tired of constantly fighting thoughts nobody else sees. And God says before your exhaustion turns into complete hopelessness, He is asking you to let go of what is slowly destroying your spirit. Not because He wants to take something from you, but because He wants to save what remains inside your heart. Even now, while you are listening to this, perhaps you already feel conviction rising quietly inside you. You already know what God has been asking you to release. You already know what keeps pulling your soul away from peace. And perhaps the reason this message feels so personal tonight is because deep down your spirit recognizes the truth. God is not trying to punish you. He is trying to free you. But freedom requires surrender, and surrender becomes hardest when chains have wrapped themselves around your heart for too long. So tonight God asks you gently, how much longer will you continue holding on to the thing that keeps breaking you before you finally trust Him enough to let it go? There are moments in life when pain becomes so heavy that people stop asking God for answers and start asking Him why. Why did this happen to me? Why did you allow this pain? Why did you stay silent when I needed you most? Maybe you have asked those questions too. Maybe there were nights when you sat alone in the dark with tears running down your face, trying to understand why life became so unbearably difficult. Perhaps you remember a hospital room filled with silence and cold white lights. Perhaps you remember standing beside a grave while rain fell softly around you. Perhaps you remember staring at your phone waiting for someone to call, and they never did. Or maybe your pain came quietly, not through one tragic moment, but through years of disappointment slowly wearing your soul down until you barely recognized yourself anymore. God says He knows exactly where your faith began hurting. He remembers the moment your heart changed, the moment fear entered, the moment trust became difficult, the moment exhaustion settled into your spirit and never fully left. And perhaps the hardest part was that nobody else truly understood what was happening inside you. People told you to stay strong, to move on, to pray more. But deep inside your soul was screaming for relief. Sometimes emotional pain becomes so deep that words stop working. You smile because explaining the truth feels impossible. You isolate because being around people feels draining. You become quieter because your spirit no longer has energy to pretend. God says many people listening tonight have been carrying invisible grief for years. Grief over relationships that ended. Grief over dreams that died. Grief over prayers that seemed unanswered. Grief over the person you used to be before pain changed you. And little by little disappointment began affecting the way you saw God Himself. Perhaps you never stopped believing in Him completely, but maybe you stopped believing He would truly show up for you personally. You still listened to messages, still prayed occasionally, still hoped quietly sometimes, but there was always that hidden wound inside whispering, "What if God stays silent again?" That fear changes people. It makes them emotionally cautious with heaven itself. They pray carefully, trust carefully, hope carefully, because disappointment taught them how painful broken expectations can become. God says tonight He wants you to understand something deeply important. Your pain never pushed Him away, not once. Even during the seasons where your faith felt weak, even during the moments you questioned Him angrily, even during the nights you cried yourself to sleep wondering where He was, God remained near you, quietly, faithfully, patiently. Maybe you could not feel him because grief was too loud. Maybe fear clouded your vision. Maybe heartbreak exhausted your spirit so completely that hope became difficult to recognize anymore. But God says his silence never meant his absence. Perhaps that is one of the hardest lessons wounded hearts must learn. Sometimes heaven is working quietly while broken people mistake silence for abandonment. And maybe tonight your soul desperately needs that reminder. Because there are things God protected you from that you still do not fully understand. There are reasons certain doors closed, reasons certain people left, reasons certain seasons ended painfully. Not all suffering comes to destroy you. Sometimes pain exposes what was already breaking inside you. Sometimes loss reveals where your identity was truly rooted. Sometimes disappointment strips away illusions so healing can finally begin honestly. God says your pain had a purpose greater than your current understanding. Not because suffering itself is good, but because God can still bring redemption out of broken things. Maybe you do not see that redemption yet. Maybe right now all you feel is exhaustion. But heaven sees the full picture your wounded heart cannot fully understand tonight. God sees the future version of you that still exists beyond this pain. The healed version, the peaceful version, the spiritually restored version. Even if you cannot imagine that person anymore. Perhaps lately you have been emotionally drowning in memories. Replaying what people did to you. Replaying mistakes. Replaying moments you wish you could change. And every replay pulls your spirit deeper into sadness. God says there comes a point where constantly reliving pain becomes another form of self-destruction. Because wounded people sometimes build homes inside their suffering. They revisit it daily, sleep beside it nightly, protect it emotionally, and eventually they forget what freedom even feels like. Maybe that is why your soul feels so tired. Not only because of what happened to you, but because you keep carrying it every single day afterward. God says tonight is not about pretending your pain never existed. It mattered. It hurt deeply, and heaven saw every second of it. But your suffering was never meant to become your permanent identity. You are more than what broke you, more than what abandoned you, more than what disappointed you, more than the mistakes you regret, more than the grief you still carry. God says the enemy wants your pain to convince you that your future has already been ruined. But heaven still sees purpose over your life. Even now, even in this exhausted season. Perhaps that is why this message found you tonight. Because your spirit has quietly been asking questions your mouth never fully spoke aloud. Questions like, will I ever feel whole again? Will this sadness ever leave? Will I ever sleep peacefully again? Will God still love me after everything? And tonight God answers gently, yes, not because you earned his love, not because your faith was perfect, not because you never struggled, but because his love for you never depended on your strength in the first place. Even now, while your heart feels tired and uncertain, heaven has not given up on you. Healing may take time. Restoration may come slowly, but God says your story is still unfolding, and perhaps the pain that once convinced you your life was ending may eventually become the very thing that leads you back into his arms again. But before healing fully begins, there is still one thing your heart keeps resisting: complete surrender. God says one of the greatest lies pain ever told you was that you were alone in the darkness, because loneliness changes the way people think. When nights become too quiet and the weight inside your chest becomes too heavy, the mind starts whispering dangerous things. Nobody understands. Nobody sees me. Nobody would care if I disappeared emotionally. And perhaps the most painful whisper of all, maybe even God left me too. Maybe you have felt that before. Maybe there were moments when you sat in complete silence staring into the darkness of your room, wondering why heaven felt so far away. You prayed, you waited, you hoped, and still life kept hurting. Still the anxiety remained. Still the grief stayed. Still, the emptiness followed you into another morning. So little by little, you stopped expecting God to show up. Not because you hated him, but because disappointment exhausted your faith. God says tonight he needs you to hear this clearly. He never abandoned you. Not once. Not during the nights you cried until your eyes hurt. Not during the panic attacks nobody knew about. Not during the moments you drove alone with tears running down your face. while pretending to everyone else that you were fine. Not during the nights you almost gave up emotionally. He was there, quietly, watching over you, holding you together in ways you never even realized. Perhaps you expected God's presence to always feel dramatic. Perhaps you thought healing would come with instant miracles or immediate answers. But often God stays closest during the quietest moments. In the silence of hospital room, in the sound of rain against the window after midnight, in the exhausted breathing of someone trying not to break apart emotionally, in the trembling prayer whispered by a wounded soul too tired to speak clearly anymore, God says He was there in all of it, even when you could not feel Him. Maybe your pain became so loud that it drowned out His voice temporarily. Maybe grief blurred your ability to recognize His presence. Maybe fear convinced you that silence meant abandonment. But heaven never walked away from you, not for a second. Perhaps tonight your soul is finally beginning to realize that surviving everything you survived was not an accident. There were moments you should have collapsed completely emotionally. Moments where your heart felt too broken to continue. Moments where darkness felt overwhelming. And somehow you still made it here. Still breathing, still listening, still searching for something deeper. God says that was Him sustaining you quietly all along. Even when your faith was weak, even when your prayers felt empty, even when your hope became fragile, He remained faithful. Maybe you think you have drifted too far from God now. Maybe guilt keeps telling you it is too late to reconnect spiritually. Too late to heal. Too late to pray sincerely again. Too late to become emotionally whole again. But God says wounded people often mistake distance for rejection. The truth is He has been waiting patiently for your heart to soften again. Not with condemnation, not with anger, but with compassion. Because God understands what pain does to human hearts. Pain makes people defensive, fearful, emotionally guarded, spiritually tired. People who were hurt deeply often stop trusting love itself, even God's love, and maybe that is what happened to you. Perhaps disappointment slowly convinced you to stop opening your heart fully, to stop expecting peace, to stop believing life could still become beautiful again. But tonight God is gently breathing hope back into exhausted places inside your soul. Not fake positivity, not denial, real hope. The kind that survives storms, the kind that remains even when tears still exist, the kind that slowly restores people from the inside out. Perhaps you still carry memories that ache every time they return. Old conversations, old betrayals, old nights where your entire world changed. God is not asking you to pretend those moments did not hurt. They mattered deeply. But He is asking you to stop believing your pain is the end of your story. Because what broke you emotionally does not have permission to define you forever. Maybe tonight, for the first time in a long time, your soul is beginning to feel something shift quietly. Not complete healing yet, not total peace yet, but maybe a small opening, a small warmth returning, a small realization that perhaps God really is still near. Perhaps this message found you because heaven knew your heart was dangerously close to giving up completely. And before despair hardened your spirit any further, God reached into your darkness with this reminder. You are still loved, still seen, still chosen, still worth saving. Even now, even after everything you regret, even after the prayers you stopped praying, even after the nights where your faith almost disappeared completely. God says your exhaustion never changed His love for you. Not once. And perhaps the reason this message feels emotional tonight is because deep down, your spirit recognizes something your mind keeps trying to resist. You were never abandoned. You only became wounded. There is a difference. Abandoned people are left alone permanently. Wounded people can still heal. Wounded people can still recover. Wounded people can still love again. Trust again. Rest again. Believe again. And God says restoration is already beginning quietly inside you, even if you cannot fully see it yet. Maybe that restoration starts with something simple tonight. Not pretending anymore. Not hiding your exhaustion anymore. Not acting strong while secretly falling apart emotionally. Maybe healing begins when you finally admit to God how tired you truly are. Because God never asked you to carry this pain alone. He never asked you to become emotionally numb just to survive. He never asked you to bury your grief behind fake smiles and silent suffering. Tonight, he is asking for honesty, raw honesty, the kind that says, God, I'm tired. God, I'm scared. God, I don't know how to heal anymore. God, I need you. And perhaps those 4 words are where restoration truly begins. Not in perfection, not in performance, but in surrender. Because God says, the moment your exhausted soul finally stops resisting his presence, healing can begin reaching the deepest wounds you spent years hiding from the world. And tonight, before your heart fully closes itself off again, God is asking you softly, will you finally let him stay close enough to heal the darkness you have been fighting alone for far too long? God says your soul has been exhausted for longer than you admit to anyone. Not just tired physically, not the kind of tired a vacation or a few extra hours of sleep could fix. This exhaustion lives deeper. It lives in your thoughts, in your breathing, in the heaviness you feel the moment you wake up each morning. Maybe you know exactly what that feels like. Opening your eyes already overwhelmed, feeling pressure in your chest before the day even begins, dragging yourself through responsibilities while secretly feeling emotionally empty inside. God says some of you listening tonight have spent so long surviving that you forgot what true rest even feels like. You became the strong one, the dependable one, the one who keeps going no matter how badly your heart hurts. People lean on you, expect things from you, need things from you. And perhaps you became so focused on carrying everyone else emotionally that nobody noticed how exhausted your own spirit had become. Not even you, because survival mode can become so normal that people stop realizing how deeply they are struggling. You smile automatically, say I'm fine automatically, keep functioning automatically, while your soul quietly begs for relief in silence. God says he sees that hidden exhaustion tonight. The exhaustion from overthinking every conversation. The exhaustion from constantly worrying about the future. The exhaustion from pretending painful memories no longer affect you. The exhaustion from carrying grief privately because you do not want to burden anyone else. Perhaps there are nights when your body feels tired but your mind refuses to rest. Your thoughts keep racing. Your fears keep replaying. Your memories keep returning. And suddenly it is 2 in the morning, then 3, then 4. While anxiety sits beside you in the dark like an unwanted companion. God says your soul was never designed to live under constant emotional pressure. You were not created to carry endless fear alone. You were not created to function without peace. And yet many people spend years disconnected from rest spiritually while wondering why they feel emotionally broken. Maybe that has been happening to you. You keep pushing yourself forward even though your spirit feels depleted. You keep pretending everything is manageable even while internally collapsing. And little by little exhaustion begins changing your heart. You become more impatient, more emotionally distant, more numb, more hopeless. Not because you are a bad person, but because tired souls struggle to carry joy for long periods of time. God says some of you listening tonight have been pouring from empty cups for years, giving love while secretly needing love yourself, supporting others while privately fighting battles nobody sees, encouraging everyone else while quietly losing hope inside your own heart. And eventually emotional burnout starts affecting your relationship with God too. Prayer feels harder, worship feels distant, faith feels exhausting instead of comforting, not because God moved away, but because your spirit became overwhelmed. Perhaps you even feel guilty for being this tired, guilty for struggling, guilty for not feeling spiritually strong anymore. But God says exhaustion does not make you weak spiritually. It makes you human. Even strong people become weary. Even faithful people become emotionally overwhelmed sometimes. Even people who deeply love God can still reach moments where their soul desperately needs rest. That is why God is speaking to you so gently tonight. Not with pressure, not with condemnation, but with compassion. Because heaven sees how close you are to emotional burnout. Maybe there are days where you feel emotionally disconnected from your own life. You go through routines automatically. Wake up, work, scroll, sleep, repeat. But internally your spirit feels empty, like something important inside you slowly faded away. God says the enemy wants exhausted people because exhausted people stop fighting for their peace. Exhausted people stop believing healing is possible. Exhausted people begin accepting emotional darkness as normal. And maybe that is what frightens you most tonight. Not the pain itself, but how normal the pain has started feeling. You became accustomed to sadness, accustomed to fear, accustomed to carrying anxiety everywhere you go. And now rest feels unfamiliar. Joy feels temporary. Peace feels distant. But God says, your current emotional exhaustion is not your permanent future. Even now, restoration is possible, not because your circumstances changed overnight, but because God can restore tired souls from the inside out. Perhaps tonight God is inviting you into something your heart has desperately needed for a very long time. Rest, real rest, not distraction, not avoidance, not emotional numbness, spiritual rest, the kind where your soul no longer has to pretend, the kind where you stop carrying tomorrow before tomorrow even arrives, the kind where your heart slowly learns how to breathe again. Maybe that sounds impossible to you right now. Maybe anxiety has been controlling your thoughts for too long. Maybe survival mode became your identity. But God says peace is still possible for you. Even after everything, even after the heartbreak, even after the trauma, even after the exhaustion that made your spirit feel older than your actual years. Heaven still believes healing can happen inside you. Perhaps this message found you tonight because your soul has been crying out for rest in ways your mouth never fully expressed. You are tired of overthinking, tired of carrying fear, tired of pretending strength while secretly feeling emotionally shattered. And God says you do not have to keep living this way forever. Maybe the first step toward healing tonight is simply allowing yourself to stop pretending, to stop acting emotionally invincible, to stop carrying everyone else while ignoring your own wounds. Because tired souls need gentleness too, and perhaps nobody has spoken gently to your spirit in a very long time. God says tonight He is inviting you to rest emotionally in His presence again. Not perfectly, not all at once, but honestly. Maybe healing begins when you finally admit, I cannot carry this alone anymore. Maybe peace begins when you stop trying to save yourself through constant control. Maybe restoration begins when your exhausted heart finally allows God back into the places fear took over. Because deep inside your soul already knows something important. You cannot heal while constantly living in survival mode. Eventually, exhausted hearts need surrender. Eventually, tired souls need stillness. Eventually, wounded spirits need God again. And tonight, before your exhaustion hardens fully into hopelessness, God is asking you softly, will you finally stop trying to carry the weight of your entire life alone and allow Him to become the place where your weary soul can finally rest? God says, there is someone you still have not forgiven. And perhaps the reason your heart still feels so heavy tonight is because unresolved pain has been living inside you for far too long. Maybe when you hear the word forgiveness, something inside you immediately tightens. Because your pain was real. What they did hurt deeply. The betrayal changed you. The abandonment changed you. The lies changed you. And part of you still feels that forgiving them means pretending the wound never mattered. But God says forgiveness was never about pretending. It was about freeing your soul from carrying poison forever. Perhaps you still replay certain memories late at night. Conversations you wish never happened. Words you cannot forget. Moments that shattered your trust completely. And even now, years later, your chest still aches when those memories return unexpectedly. God says unresolved bitterness quietly drains peace from the soul. Not all at once. Slowly. Day after day. Until eventually pain becomes part of the way you think, speak, and live. Maybe you have become more guarded because of what happened. More suspicious. More emotionally distant. More afraid to trust anyone fully again. Not because you wanted to become this version of yourself, but because wounds changed the way your heart learned to survive. Perhaps there are nights when anger still rises suddenly inside you. Not loud anger. Quiet anger. The kind that hides beneath your smile. The kind that returns when you are alone. The kind that whispers they ruined something inside me. God says He understands why your heart struggles to let go. He saw the tears nobody else saw. He saw how deeply their actions wounded you. He saw the nights where you questioned your worth because of how you were treated. And He is not asking you to deny any of that pain tonight. But he is asking you to understand something important. Bitterness keeps wounds alive. The people who hurt you may already be gone. The relationship may already be over. The season may already have ended. But the pain keeps surviving inside you because your heart never truly released it. And maybe that is why peace still feels distant, because your spirit has been carrying emotional chains for too long. Perhaps there is someone you still blame for everything that changed in your life. A parent who failed you, a partner who betrayed you, a friend who disappeared when you needed them most, maybe even someone who apologized, but your heart could never fully trust again afterward. God says bitterness convinces wounded people that holding on to pain will somehow protect them from future heartbreak. But over time, the bitterness begins hurting you more than the original wound itself. It steals softness from your spirit. It steals joy from ordinary moments. It steals emotional safety from future relationships. And eventually it begins isolating you from the peace God wants your soul to experience. Maybe forgiveness feels unfair because the other person never fully understood the damage they caused. Maybe they moved on while you were left carrying emotional scars. Maybe part of you still wants justice before release. God understands that too. But forgiveness was never saying what happened was acceptable. Forgiveness says, I refuse to let this pain continue controlling my spirit forever. And perhaps tonight your soul desperately needs that freedom. Maybe you are exhausted because your heart has spent years fighting silent emotional battles nobody knows about. Trying to appear healed while secretly still bleeding inside. Trying to move forward while part of your spirit remains trapped in old pain. God says healing becomes difficult when your heart keeps returning to the wound emotionally every day. Because wounds cannot close while constantly being reopened. Perhaps even now, while listening to this, someone's face entered your mind immediately. The person connected to your deepest pain. The person your soul still struggles to release. God says your healing may be waiting on the other side of surrender. Not because forgiving is easy, but because bitterness has become too heavy for your spirit to carry any longer. And maybe the hardest truth tonight is this. The person you still blame may not be the only one your heart is angry with. Perhaps beneath all the resentment toward others, you are secretly angry with yourself too. Angry for trusting too much. Angry for staying too long. Angry for ignoring red flags. Angry for not being able to move on faster. Many wounded people carry hidden self-hatred after painful seasons. They replay their mistakes constantly, judge themselves constantly, punish themselves emotionally for things they wish they could undo. God says some of you listening tonight have become prisoners of your own guilt, not only because of what others did, but because of how harshly you continue treating yourself afterward. And maybe that is why your soul feels so exhausted, because self-condemnation is heavy. Carrying shame every day is heavy. Believing you are permanently damaged is heavy. But God says your mistakes were never meant to become your identity either. You are not beyond restoration, not beyond healing, not beyond love. Even now, even after everything. Perhaps tonight God is asking you to release more than anger toward other people. Perhaps He is asking you to release the version of yourself trapped inside old pain too. The version constantly reliving regret. Constantly replaying failure, constantly punishing themselves emotionally. God says you cannot fully heal while continuing to hate yourself secretly. And perhaps that realization feels overwhelming tonight, because many people know how to survive pain, but very few know how to truly release it. Maybe your heart became so accustomed to suffering that peace now feels unfamiliar. Maybe sadness became part of your identity. Maybe emotional heaviness became your normal. But God says freedom is still possible, even for you, even after years of bitterness, even after years of grief, even after years of carrying invisible emotional chains. Heaven still believes your heart can become soft again, still believes your soul can rest again, still believes love can reach the places pain tried to destroy. But forgiveness remains the doorway your spirit keeps standing in front of, afraid to walk through, afraid to trust what exists on the other side. And tonight God asks you gently, how much longer will you allow old pain to keep controlling your present life? Before you finally release what your exhausted soul was never meant to carry forever. God says some of you have spent so much time blaming yourselves that you no longer know how to see yourselves through His eyes. You replay your mistakes constantly. The things you said, the things you failed to say, the opportunities you lost, the people you hurt, the moments you wish you could erase completely. And even when nobody else is accusing you anymore, your own mind continues punishing you in silence. Maybe you know exactly what that feels like. Lying awake at night while old memories replay over and over again. Feeling shame rise suddenly in your chest when you remember a past version of yourself. Wondering how your life might have turned out differently if you had made another decision. God says many wounded people secretly believe they are beyond restoration. Too broken, too flawed, too damaged emotionally, too far from God now. And perhaps that belief has been quietly shaping the way you live. You struggle accepting love because you do not fully believe you deserve it. You struggle receiving peace because guilt convinces you suffering is what you deserve now. You struggle moving forward because part of you remains trapped in yesterday emotionally. But tonight God says your mistakes were never stronger than His mercy. Not once. Even the moments you regret most deeply did not surprise heaven. God knew every weakness you would have, every fear, every failure, every wrong turn, and He still chose to love you. Perhaps that is difficult for your heart to believe tonight, because human beings are often far less forgiving toward themselves than God is toward them. People replay their worst moments endlessly. They define themselves by seasons God already wanted to redeem. They carry shame long after heaven offered grace, and eventually guilt becomes another prison around the soul. Maybe you have become emotionally exhausted from fighting yourself internally every day. One part of you wants healing. Another part believes you no longer deserve it. One part of you wants peace. Another part keeps reopening old wounds through regret. And little by little, self-condemnation drains hope from your spirit. God says shame is one of the enemy's most destructive weapons, because shame convinces people to hide from God instead of running toward Him. It whispers you are too dirty now, too inconsistent, too spiritually weak, too damaged. But God says tonight that shame has lied to you long enough. You are not disqualified from healing because of your past. You are not abandoned because you struggled. You are not rejected because you failed. Maybe your life does not look the way you imagined it would years ago. Maybe there are broken pieces everywhere, dreams that never happened, relationships that ended painfully. Versions of yourself you barely recognize now, and perhaps part of you still mourns the person you used to be before life became this heavy. God understands that grief too, but He also sees the version of you that still exists beyond this exhausted season. The healed version, the peaceful version, the spiritually restored version, even if you cannot see that person clearly yet. Maybe tonight God is asking you to stop speaking to yourself with the same cruelty pain taught you. Because some of you survived difficult seasons physically, but emotionally you never stopped blaming yourselves afterward. You became your own harshest critic, your own source of condemnation. You learned how to survive externally while quietly destroying yourself internally. God says that is not how He sees you. He does not look at you and see only failure. He sees someone wounded, someone tired, someone carrying invisible battles for far too long. Someone who still needs compassion, even now. Perhaps you keep expecting yourself to heal instantly, to move on quickly, to become emotionally strong overnight. But healing rarely happens that way. Sometimes restoration begins softly, quietly, one honest prayer at a time, one surrendered memory at a time. One small moment of hope returning after years of emotional darkness. Maybe tonight your soul is beginning to realize something important. You cannot hate yourself into healing. No amount of self-punishment will rewrite the past. No amount of regret will change what already happened. And perhaps God is asking you gently tonight, what if mercy applies to you too? What if grace was never only for other people? What if God still loves you deeply despite every mistake your mind keeps replaying? Maybe that possibility feels almost impossible for your wounded heart to accept, because guilt became familiar, shame became normal, self-condemnation became part of your daily thinking. But God says your identity was never supposed to be built around your worst moments. Your life is bigger than your failures. Your future is bigger than your regret. And heaven still sees purpose inside you even while you struggle to see value in yourself. Perhaps you still remember moments where you genuinely felt close to God once. Moments where faith felt alive. Moments where your heart felt lighter. But disappointment and regret slowly convinced you that version of yourself was gone forever. God says it is not gone. Wounded does not mean destroyed. Exhausted does not mean abandoned. And broken does not mean unusable. In fact, some of the people God restores most beautifully are the ones who once believed restoration was impossible for them. Maybe tonight is the beginning of that restoration for you. Not because every problem disappeared, not because every wound suddenly healed, but because your heart is finally becoming honest about how deeply it needs grace. Real grace, not the kind you offer everyone else while denying it to yourself. The kind that reaches into your shame and says you are still loved here. The kind that sits beside exhausted people in the middle of the night and reminds them they are not beyond redemption. The kind that sees every scar and still whispers there is still hope for your life. Perhaps this message found you because your soul has spent too many years believing healing belonged to everyone except you. But tonight God is interrupting that lie, because your story is not over. Your failures are not final, and the person you became after pain is not the person you must remain forever. Still, there is one final step your heart keeps resisting before complete healing can begin. Letting go of the fear that God could never fully restore someone like you. God says something is beginning to change inside you tonight. Maybe you cannot fully explain it yet. Maybe the heaviness has not disappeared completely. Maybe the pain still exists, but somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, beneath the fear, beneath the emotional numbness, something inside your spirit is slowly waking up again. And perhaps that feeling scares you a little, because hope can feel dangerous after enough disappointment. When people have been hurt repeatedly, they learn not to expect too much anymore. They stop dreaming loudly, stop praying boldly, stop believing life could truly become different, because part of them feels safer expecting nothing. At least then disappointment cannot hurt them again. Maybe that is where your heart has been living lately. In survival mode, emotionally cautious, spiritually guarded, afraid to trust happiness because pain taught you how quickly things can change. But God says tonight is not about returning to fake positivity. It is not about pretending your struggles are gone. It is about recognizing that your story is still moving forward even if the season has been painfully dark. Perhaps for a long time you believed your life had already reached its ending emotionally, not physically, but internally. You stopped expecting peace, stopped expecting healing, stopped expecting God to truly restore what felt broken beyond repair. And maybe you became so accustomed to disappointment that hopelessness started feeling normal. God says hopelessness is not your permanent home, even if you have lived there emotionally for years. Perhaps tonight is the first time in a long time your soul has felt truly seen. Not judged, not pressured, not forced to pretend, simply seen. And there is something powerful about being seen by God after feeling emotionally invisible for so long, because many people carry pain quietly. They function, work, smile, help others, yet secretly feel disconnected from themselves inside. Maybe you became so focused on surviving that you forgot your heart still needed care too, needed gentleness, needed healing, needed God. And perhaps heaven allowed this message to find you tonight because your spirit was beginning to lose hope completely. God says before restoration fully begins, many people pass through a season where everything inside them feels tired. Faith feels tired, dreams feel tired, emotions feel tired, even prayer feels tired. But exhaustion does not mean God abandoned the process. Sometimes exhausted seasons happen right before breakthrough seasons. Not because suffering itself is beautiful, but because brokenness often softens hearts enough for healing to finally enter honestly. Maybe that is what is happening inside you right now. Perhaps your spirit is finally becoming honest about how much it needs God again. Not religion, not performance, not pretending. Real connection, real peace, real healing. The kind that reaches deep beneath surface-level words and touches the places inside you that nobody else fully understands. God says some of you have been trying to heal yourselves entirely through distraction, through busyness, through constant noise, through endless scrolling late at night, through the staying emotionally occupied so you never have to sit quietly with your own pain. But distractions only delay healing. Eventually the silence returns. Eventually the grief returns. Eventually the loneliness speaks again. And perhaps tonight, instead of running from the silence, your soul is finally beginning to listen. Because beneath all the fear, beneath all the sadness, beneath all the exhaustion, there is still a small part of you that wants to believe healing is possible. Even after everything, even after the heartbreak, even after the disappointments that changed your entire life emotionally, God says that small remaining hope matters more than you realize. Because even fragile hope can become the beginning of restoration. Maybe you thought God only moved through dramatic miracle, but often restoration begins quietly. A little peace returning to your thoughts, a little softness returning to your heart, a little willingness to trust again, a little less fear controlling your spirit each day. Healing rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes God restores people slowly because wounded hearts need gentleness. Perhaps your soul has been bruised by life more deeply than most people know, and God is not rushing your healing tonight. He is walking beside it patiently. Maybe that is what you needed to hear most, that you are not failing because recovery feels slow, that you are not weak because some wounds still hurt, that you are not spiritually broken because certain nights still feel heavy. God says healing is not linear. Some nights will still feel lonely. Some mornings will still feel difficult. Some memories will still ache unexpectedly. But that does not mean restoration is not happening. Sometimes healing is simply choosing not to give up emotionally one more day. Sometimes healing is crying honestly instead of pretending. Sometimes healing is whispering, God, I still need you even when your faith feels fragile, Sandil. And perhaps tonight your exhausted spirit is finally beginning to understand this. You survive for a reason, not by accident, not randomly. There were moments darkness almost consumed you completely. Moments where hopelessness felt overwhelming. Moments where your heart became so tired you did not know how to keep carrying life emotionally. And yet somehow you are still here, still breathing, still listening, still searching. God says heaven preserved you through seasons that should have destroyed your spirit completely. Not because you were strong all the time, but because God stayed near even when you could not feel Him. Perhaps tonight is the beginning of seeing your pain differently. Not as proof God abandoned you, but as proof that even through everything your soul survived, and survival means purpose still exists over your life. Maybe you do not fully know what the future looks like yet. Maybe answers still feel unclear. Maybe healing still feels incomplete. But God says your current season is not your final chapter. There is still peace ahead, still joy ahead, still restoration ahead, still life ahead, even if your tired heart struggles to imagine it tonight. And perhaps that is why this message reached you before the night ended. Because God knew your soul needed hope again before. Hopelessness convinced you to stop believing completely. But before restoration fully unfolds, there is still one thing your heart must finally stop doing. Running away from God whenever pain becomes difficult to understand. God says many people run from Him without even realizing they are running. Not physically, emotionally, spiritually, quietly. Sometimes people stop praying consistently because disappointment made prayer feel painful. Sometimes they distract themselves constantly because silence forces them to face wounds they have spent years avoiding. Sometimes they fill every empty moment with noise because deep down they are afraid of what their own thoughts might say if everything became still. Maybe you understand that feeling tonight. Maybe your life has become full of distractions lately, scrolling endlessly at night, keeping yourself busy constantly, avoiding moments where your mind has time to slow down. Not because you are lazy, not because you do not care, but because deep down, there are emotions your heart has been afraid to confront honestly. God says pain often pushes people into hiding, not only from others, but from Him too. Maybe part of you still loves God deeply, but another part feels afraid to get too close again, afraid to trust fully again, afraid to hope deeply again. Because if hope rises and life hurts you once more, your exhausted heart does not know if it can survive another disappointment. So instead, you stay emotionally guarded. You pray carefully, trust carefully, feel carefully, and little by little distance grows between your heart and God. Not because He moved away, but because fear convinced you to protect yourself spiritually. Perhaps there were seasons where talking to God felt natural, where faith brought comfort instead of confusion, where your heart felt softer, lighter, more alive. But pain changes people, especially unresolved pain. It teaches hearts to become cautious, suspicious, emotionally defensive, and maybe that is what happened to you. Maybe somewhere along the way you stopped bringing your full heart to God because disappointment taught you vulnerability felt dangerous. God says tonight He is not angry at your fear. He understands wounded hearts. He understands why people pull away emotionally after enough heartbreak. But He also knows distance cannot heal what only His presence can restore. Perhaps that is why your soul still feels restless even after trying everything else. You tried distractions. You tried isolation. You tried pretending you were okay. You tried carrying everything yourself. Yet the emptiness remained. Because some parts of the soul cannot heal without reconnecting to God again. Maybe tonight your spirit is finally tired of running, tired of pretending, tired of distracting itself from deeper pain. Perhaps you are beginning to realize that avoiding your wounds never truly healed them. It only delayed the confrontation, and eventually buried pain always rises again, especially in quiet moments, especially late at night. Especially when life slows down long enough for the soul to speak honestly. God says some of you listening tonight have become experts at hiding emotional pain behind functioning lives. You still work, still smile, still answer messages, still show up for everyone else. Yet privately your spirit feels disconnected and exhausted. And perhaps nobody truly realizes how badly your soul misses peace. Not temporary relief, real peace. The kind that calms anxious thoughts, the kind that softens emotional heaviness, the kind that reminds wounded people they are still loved even after everything. God says you do not need another distraction tonight. You need His presence again, not shallow religion, not empty routines, real connection, real surrender, real honesty. Perhaps that honesty begins with admitting something your pride resisted for a long time. You cannot carry your life entirely alone anymore. Maybe that realization feels emotional tonight, because many people spend years trying to prove they are strong enough to survive independently, strong enough to suppress grief, strong enough to manage anxiety alone, strong enough to heal themselves through willpower. But exhausted souls eventually discover their limits, and perhaps your spirit reached that limit already. Maybe that is why you feel emotionally drained all the time now. Because your soul has been fighting battles without rest for too long. God says surrender is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the moment a wounded heart finally stops pretending it can survive, disconnected from God forever. And perhaps tonight heaven is waiting for your honesty more than your perfection. Not polished prayers, not religious performance, just honesty. The kind that says, God, I'm tired of running. God, I'm tired of pretending. God, I don't know how to heal without you anymore. Perhaps those words are where restoration truly begins. Because healing starts when denial ends, and maybe part of your exhaustion came from trying to avoid truths your spirit already knew. You knew you needed peace, needed healing, needed God, but fear kept whispering, what if nothing changes? God says fear has kept your heart trapped for too long. Fear of disappointment, fear of vulnerability, fear of trusting again. Fear of surrendering control, but control never brought your soul peace. Overthinking never healed your heart. Isolation never restored your spirit. And distractions never removed the emptiness permanently. Perhaps tonight is the moment your soul finally stops resisting what it has secretly needed all along. Not another temporary escape, but God Himself. Because beneath all the exhaustion, beneath all the sadness, beneath all the emotional walls, your spirit is still longing for Him, still searching for rest, still searching for home. Maybe that longing explains why this message feels so personal tonight. Why certain words hit your heart more deeply than expected. Why emotions keep rising while you listen. Your soul recognizes something. It recognizes truth. And the truth is this: you were never meant to heal alone. You were never meant to carry endless emotional pain without help. You were never meant to live disconnected from the one who created your heart. God says tonight is not about condemning you for drifting. It is about inviting you back gently before hopelessness steals even more from your life. Because heaven still believes restoration is possible for you, still believes peace can return, still believes your heart can soften again, even after everything. But restoration requires one final decision from you: to stop running from God every time pain makes your faith uncomfortable, and finally allow His presence to enter the places fear has controlled for far too long. God says chains are beginning to break off your life tonight. Not physical chains, invisible ones, the kind wrapped around the mind, around the heart, around the soul. Chains made from fear, shame, hopelessness, self-hatred, years of emotional exhaustion. Perhaps you have carried those chains for so long that part of you forgot what freedom even feels like. You became used to anxiety following you everywhere, used to heaviness sitting in your chest, used to expecting disappointment before good things even had a chance to happen. And slowly, without realizing it, emotional survival became your entire identity. But God says you were never created to live emotionally imprisoned forever. You were not created to spend your life trapped inside fear. You were not created to constantly battle thoughts telling you that you are not enough. And you were never meant to carry the weight of hopelessness alone. Maybe tonight, for the first time in a long time, your soul feels something shifting quietly. Not because every circumstance changed overnight, but because truth is finally reaching the places pain once controlled. God says the enemy worked hard to convince you that your chains were permanent. That anxiety would always define you. That depression would always follow you. That your heart would always remain broken. That your future would always feel heavy. But heaven never agreed with those lies. Not once. Even during the seasons where your spirit felt weakest, God still saw freedom ahead for you. Perhaps you could not imagine that freedom because pain clouded your vision. Fear narrows perspective. It convinces people their current darkness will last forever. And after enough suffering, hopelessness begins sounding believable. Maybe there were nights where your thoughts became so overwhelming that you felt emotionally trapped inside your own mind. No peace, no quiet, no rest. Only constant overthinking, constant worry, constant emotional pressure. God says some of you listening tonight became prisoners of fear without even realizing it. Fear of failure. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of the future, fear that life will never truly improve. And fear slowly controls people's lives when left unchecked. It changes decisions, relationships, dreams, faith. Eventually, people stop living fully because fear taught them survival feels safer than hope. But God says fear has taken enough from you already. Enough sleep, enough peace, enough joy. Enough years of your life. Tonight, heaven is confronting those chains before they steal even more from your spirit. Perhaps there are moments where you secretly feel emotionally exhausted from fighting your own mind every day, trying to silence negative thoughts, trying to quiet anxiety, trying to believe things will get better while another voice inside keeps whispering, "What if they never do?" God understands how exhausting that battle can become. And He is not ashamed of your struggle, not ashamed of your tears, not ashamed of your emotional scars. In fact, God often draws closest to people who feel weakest, because exhausted souls stop pretending. Broken hearts become honest, and honesty creates space for healing. Maybe tonight your soul is finally becoming honest about how deeply fear has controlled your life, controlled your peace, controlled your confidence, controlled your ability to trust. Perhaps fear even affected your relationship with God more than you realized. You became afraid to expect too much from heaven, afraid to pray boldly, afraid to believe restoration could actually happen for someone like you. But God says your fear was never stronger than His power to restore. Not once. Maybe this message found you tonight because heaven knew your spirit was reaching its limit. Tired of surviving, tired of overthinking, tired of emotional heaviness, tired of carrying invisible battles nobody fully understands. And tonight God is reminding you that chains can break, not always instantly, not always dramatically, but truly. Sometimes freedom begins quietly. A fearful thought loses power. An anxious heart experiences one moment of peace. A wounded person begins believing hope might still exist. A tired soul finally stops fighting alone. Perhaps that process is beginning inside you right now. Maybe your heart still feels fragile. Maybe healing still feels incomplete. But even now, something inside you is starting to resist hopelessness again. That matters more than you realize. Because hopelessness wants people to stop fighting entirely, to stop believing, to stop expecting healing. But your spirit is still listening tonight, still searching, still reaching toward a God despite everything you survived. And heaven sees that. Perhaps one of the biggest chains God wants to break tonight is the belief that you will never change emotionally. That you will always be this anxious, always this broken, always this tired. But God says healing changes people slowly from the inside out. One surrendered fear at a time. One honest prayer at a time. One night of choosing hope instead of despair at a time. Maybe freedom does not begin with feeling strong. Maybe freedom begins with finally admitting how weak you have felt for so long. Because people who hide their struggles rarely heal deeply. But people who bring their wounds honestly before God create space for restoration. And perhaps tonight your soul is finally opening that door. Not perfectly, not fearlessly, but honestly. Maybe tonight you are beginning to believe that peace could still exist for you too. Not just for other people, for you. Even after the anxiety, even after the heartbreak, even after the years spent emotionally surviving instead of living fully. God says restoration is not a fantasy for your life. Freedom is not impossible for your heart. Healing is not beyond your reach. Even now, especially now. Because sometimes the darkest seasons become the very places where God begins rebuilding people from the inside. Maybe you still feel uncertain about the future tonight. Maybe questions still remain unanswered. Maybe your healing journey still feels long. But God says chains are already weakening that once convinced you your life would never change. Fear no longer gets the final word. Hopelessness no longer controls your identity. Pain no longer owns your future. And perhaps tonight, for the first time in a long time, your soul is finally beginning to breathe again. Still, before complete restoration comes, there is one final truth God needs your heart to fully understand. Everything you survived had a purpose greater than the pain itself. God says the pain you survived was never meaningless, even though there were nights when it felt unbearable. Even though there were moments when your heart could not understand why life unfolded the way it did. Even though some wounds changed you so deeply that you barely recognize parts of yourself anymore. Still, heaven never lost sight of purpose over your life. Perhaps that is difficult for you to believe tonight. Because when people are suffering, purpose often feels invisible. Pain narrows vision. Grief clouds understanding. Fear makes the future feel dark and uncertain. And maybe for a long time, all you could see was what was lost. The relationship that ended, the dream that collapsed, the person who walked away, the season that broke you emotionally, the prayers that seemed unanswered. God says he saw every moment where your soul struggled to keep going, every exhausted breath, every silent tear, every night where loneliness sat beside you like a shadow in the dark. And even though your pain was real, it was never the end of your story. Maybe you spent years asking, why would God allow this? Why allow heartbreak? Why allow betrayal? Why allow grief so heavy it changes the way a person sees life itself? God says some answers are only understood later after healing begins softening the heart again. Because sometimes people only recognize how deeply God carried them after they survived the very thing they thought would destroy them. Perhaps tonight your spirit is beginning to realize something quietly. You survived more than you thought you would. There were seasons where you almost gave up emotionally. Seasons where hopelessness felt stronger than faith. Seasons where you questioned whether peace would ever return again. And yet somehow, through every dark night, you continued moving forward one breath at a time. God says that matters. Because survival itself became evidence that heaven never stopped holding you together. Maybe your pain changed you, but it also deepened you. Perhaps before suffering, you depended mostly on comfort, mostly on certainty, mostly on things going according to your plans. But pain revealed how fragile human control truly is. And somewhere in the middle of your exhaustion, your soul slowly began searching for something deeper than temporary happiness. Something eternal, something real, something strong enough to hold you together when life fell apart unexpectedly. God says sometimes suffering becomes the doorway through which people finally discover how deeply they need Him. Not because He enjoys watching people hurt, but because brokenness strips away illusions. It exposes what truly matters. It reveals where hearts have been placing their identity. Perhaps your pain forced you to confront truths you had avoided for years. Truths about fear, about emotional wounds, about loneliness, about the exhaustion hidden beneath your constant pretending. And maybe tonight, for the first time in a very long time, your soul feels honest again. Not polished, not perfect, just honest. God says honesty is where healing becomes real, because many people spend years pretending to be emotionally fine, while silently falling apart inside. But healing begins when masks come off, when pride softens, when exhausted hearts finally whisper, "God, I need you." Perhaps tonight your spirit understands something now that it could not understand before pain changed your life. This world cannot fully satisfy the soul. People cannot carry the weight only God was meant to carry. Distractions cannot heal wounds permanently, and emotional numbness cannot create true peace. Only God can reach the deepest parts of a wounded heart. Only His presence can calm the kind of exhaustion that sleep never fixes. Only His love can restore the identity pain tried to steal from you. Maybe your suffering also made you more compassionate, more understanding of other people's hidden pain, more sensitive to loneliness, more aware that everyone carries invisible battles. Broken people often become gentler because suffering taught them what heavy hearts feel like. God says none of your tears were wasted. None of your nights were unseen. None of your pain disappeared into emptiness. Even now, heaven remembers every moment you fought to survive emotionally. And perhaps one day you will look back at this season differently. Not as the season that destroyed your life, but as the season that transformed your soul. The season where God slowly rebuilt you from the inside. Maybe tonight you still cannot fully understand everything you went through. That is okay. Healing does not require immediate answers. Sometimes faith means trusting God before clarity arrives. Trusting that even painful chapters can still hold purpose beyond what exhausted hearts currently understand. God says your story is still unfolding. This is not your final chapter. Even if sadness convinced you it was, even if fear convinced you nothing would ever change, even if disappointment convinced you restoration belonged to everyone except you, heaven still sees beauty ahead for your life, still sees peace ahead, still sees healing ahead, still sees purpose rising from the places pain once tried to bury. Perhaps tonight your heart is finally beginning to release the belief that suffering ruined your future forever. Because what happened to you may have wounded your spirit, but it did not cancel God's plan over your life. Not once. And maybe the greatest proof of that is this very moment right now. You are still here, still listening, still breathing, still searching for hope despite everything you survived. That means darkness did not win. Pain did not fully destroy your spirit. Hopelessness did not have the final word over your life. God says restoration often begins quietly before people fully recognize it. Like sunlight slowly entering a dark room after a long storm. Softly, patiently, gently. Perhaps that light is already reaching your soul tonight. Perhaps your heart is already becoming softer. Perhaps peace is already beginning to return little by little. Not because life suddenly became perfect, but because your spirit is finally opening itself to God again. After years of emotional exhaustion. And maybe one day you will realize this night truly changed something inside you forever. Maybe this was the night your hopelessness finally began losing its grip. The night your heart stopped running. The night your soul finally understood that even through all the pain, God never stopped carrying you. And tonight, before this message ends, heaven wants you to remember one final truth. Your brokenness was never stronger than God's ability to restore what pain tried to destroy. God says this message reached you tonight for a reason. Not randomly, not accidentally, not because you happened to scroll at the perfect moment, but because heaven knew your soul needed this reminder before hopelessness convinced you to give up completely. Maybe when this message first began, your heart felt heavy in ways difficult to explain. Maybe exhaustion had already become your normal. Maybe loneliness had followed you for so long that silence itself started feeling painful. Perhaps part of you almost ignored this message at first, almost scrolled away, almost convinced yourself these words could not possibly matter. But something inside you stayed. Something inside your spirit kept listening. And God says that matters more than you realize. Because even after all the pain, even after all the disappointment, even after all the nights where your faith became fragile, part of your soul still wanted hope, still wanted healing, still wanted God. Perhaps tonight, for the first time in a long time, your heart finally feels understood. Not judged for struggling, not condemned for being tired, not criticized for needing help, simply understood. God says many wounded people secretly believe they must heal perfectly before coming back to Him. But that was never true. You do not have to clean yourself up before God draws near. You do not have to hide your exhaustion. You do not have to pretend your faith has been strong every moment. God already knows the truth about your heart. He saw every tear you hid from other people, every silent breakdown, every lonely drive at night, every anxious thought that kept you awake long after midnight, every moment where sadness became so heavy you did not know how to explain it anymore. He saw all of it, and He stayed. Maybe that truth is difficult for your wounded heart to fully accept, because pain taught you people leave, people disappoint, people become distant when things become difficult. But God says His love does not operate like human love. He does not walk away every time your heart struggles. He does not abandon you when your faith feels weak. He does not reject you because healing takes time. Even now, after everything you survived emotionally, heaven still calls you loved, still calls you chosen, still calls you worth restoring. Perhaps tonight your soul is finally realizing that the enemy lied to you for a very long time. He lied when he said your life would never improve. He lied when he said you were too broken to heal. He lied when he convinced you your mistakes were bigger than God's mercy. He lied when he told you nobody cared about your pain. And perhaps the biggest lie of all was this, that your story was over. God says your story is not over tonight, not even close. There is still purpose ahead of you, still peace ahead of you, still healing ahead of you, still love ahead of you, even if your exhausted heart struggles to believe it fully right now. Perhaps this season almost destroyed your faith, but it also revealed how deeply your soul truly needs God. Maybe that realization became the beginning of your restoration. Not religion, not perfection. Relationship. Real relationship with the God who remained near you through every dark season. Perhaps healing begins tonight not with dramatic emotions, but with surrender. Quiet surrender. The kind where your soul finally stops fighting alone. The kind where your exhausted heart whispers, God, I cannot carry this by myself anymore. Maybe tonight is not the end of your struggles completely. Maybe some wounds still need time. Maybe some questions remain unanswered. But something important changed inside you tonight. Hopelessness no longer feels as powerful. Fear no longer sounds completely believable. And perhaps for the first time in a very long time, your spirit feels a small spark of peace returning again. That matters, because restoration often begins quietly before it becomes visible. Like dawn slowly appearing after a long night, softly, patiently, gently. Maybe your soul has been waiting for that dawn for years, waiting for proof that darkness would not last forever. God says this message was part of that reminder, part of heaven reaching into your exhausted life and whispering, do not give up now. Because there were moments where you almost gave up emotionally, moments where you became tired of carrying invisible pain, moments where your soul quietly wondered if healing would ever come. And tonight God answers that question gently. Yes, healing is still possible. Peace is still possible. Rest is still possible. Even for you. Even after everything. Perhaps you thought your wounds disqualified you from being loved deeply by God. But sometimes the people who feel most broken become the very people who encounter His grace most personally, because exhausted souls stop pretending, and honest hearts are easier for God to heal. Maybe tonight your heart feels softer than it has in a long time. Maybe tears came unexpectedly while listening. Maybe certain words reached places inside you nobody else has touched in years. That is not weakness. That is your spirit responding to truth. And the truth is this: you survived for a reason. You are still here for a reason. Your heart is still beating for a reason. God did not preserve your life through all those painful seasons just to abandon you now. There is still purpose attached to your future. Still beauty waiting beyond this storm. Still healing waiting beyond this exhaustion. Still light waiting beyond this darkness. And perhaps one day you will look back at tonight as the moment everything slowly began changing inside you. The night your heart stopped running. The night your spirit remembered God again. The night hope quietly returned after years of emotional heaviness. Because this message was never sent to shame you. It was sent to save you from becoming permanently trapped inside hopelessness. And tonight, before you close your eyes, God wants you to remember one final thing. You are not forgotten. You are not abandoned. You are not beyond healing. And no matter how dark this season has felt, God is still leading you back toward the light. One of the hardest lessons life teaches us is that not every battle is meant to destroy us. Some battles are meant to wake us up. There are moments when pain enters our lives so deeply that we begin questioning everything: our worth, our future, even our faith. But sometimes the very season that almost broke you becomes the season that brings you closer to the person God created you to be. Maybe you've cried silently at night while everyone else thought you were strong. Maybe you've smiled in front of people while your heart felt completely exhausted inside. But never forget this: surviving those dark moments already proves there is something powerful inside you that refuses to give up. Healing does not happen overnight. Sometimes it begins quietly, with one honest prayer, one small step forward, one moment where you decide not to quit on yourself anymore. And perhaps that is why you are here today. Maybe God wanted to remind you that your story is not over yet. If this message touched your heart, take a moment to comment your location and local time below. I truly love reading every message and prayer request from around the world. And if you want more healing and faith-filled messages like this, gently subscribe to the channel and stay connected with this community. You are never alone here.